Well, hello and welcome, or welcome back, to That Girl's Quilting Threads and Things. My name's Diana, and this is my channel where I try to share with you, the viewer, tips and tricks on things that I've learned along my way in my quilting journeys. And hopefully I can pass them along to you to make your quilting journeys just a little bit easier. So today's project, we're going to put together a basic 9-patch quilt block. Now, the reason why I chose this is because I found that when I'm putting my 9-patch quilt blocks together, just the basics, I'm able to see areas where I may be able to improve my cutting. Maybe how I can line up my seams and my fabrics just a little bit better, and I can even focus with intensity mastering my 1/4-inch seam allowance. And what this does for me when I build these basic 9-patch quilt blocks, it brings me back to attention to detail. And when I start to put together those more complex quilt blocks, the techniques that I learned and practiced with the basic 9-patch quilt block will come into play. So hopefully today's video will do the same for you. So come and join me at the quilting station and let's get started with our basic 9-patch quilt block. So I'm getting ready to do a couple of projects for my grandsons. I'm going to try out a couple of disappearing 9-patch options. But first, in order to have a disappearing 9-patch, you need to have a 9-patch block. So this is really a very simple video just to give basic instructions on putting together a 9-patch block. And I really like a 9-patch block because it's a great block that you can use to practice with your seam allowance, making sure that your stitch lines are straight, and you can also practice nesting your seams. So let me go ahead and show you how I'll put a basic 9-patch block together. I like to do it in pairs. On the top row, I'll take the center block in that row, right side together, make sure that my blocks are nicely lined up, and then I'll sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance down this side. And I'll do the same thing with this one. And I will chain stitch these as I'm doing them. All right, and I want to make sure it's all nice and lined up. And then I'll do it with the 3rd row. One of the things that you can do is when you're putting your fabric right side together, if you can see part of your square underneath, then that's an indicator that maybe you're not cutting your fabric straight. Or it could be because you might be using 2 different rulers that have different visual metric lines on them. So when I lay my block right side facing the other on top of the bottom block, and I see something that looks like this, if you can see that red is sticking out pretty significantly, then I might want to bring in my ruler and just make sure that my block is the right size. So here we have a basic block, and if I go and use this regular plain ruler, if I go to put them right there on the edge of the fabric, we can see that this line, and only this line, there's no shadow, there's no highlight or anything like that. And when I get a good sight picture on it, I am looking down on this ruler. I like to always say I include the line when I cut. So I don't put the line on the edge of the fabric. So here's a very exaggerated example. I put it on the fabric. And if I can see the fabric on the other side of the line, it's too far. I adjust my sight picture. When I am looking at this, I look at all of my fabric the same way. What is a sight picture? The sight picture is how you look at something. So that's this ruler. I love these rulers. They're great. They have very thin lines, easy for measuring, and they have all of the tick marks that are needed. Now let's take a look at another ruler. With this ruler, we can see very fine black tick lines, but we also see a halo around where all of the metrics are. And I like these sometimes because these metrics the way the halo is right around the black line, they represent 1/8 of an inch. If there's any imperfections in the ruler, or if it's a poor quality ruler, using these as a guide may not be the best. But what I like about it is that with these types of rulers, sometimes it helps me see better on darker colored fabrics. There's something, this is just me, I don't know if it's the same for everybody else. What I do when I cut fabric is, these yellow lines right here, if I were to shift that over, right? This yellow line right here is exactly the same width as these black metric lines. So whenever I'm cutting, whether it's a 1/4 inch or on the 1/2 inch mark, I always know that this line is the same, and I include it on my fabric. So let's take a look at a ruler that I no longer use, with the exception of using as a straight edge for support. While this ruler utilizes white and red lines for its metrics, all of the lines have a white highlight around them. And so when we go to look at how thick those lines actually are, when I go to measure, so if I line these black tick marks up with the white edge to the white edge, we can see that from this side of the white line to this side of the white line is almost 1/8 of an inch. And so when I go to line my fabric up, if I line this up exactly, I can't quite tell whether or not this thin red line is all the way on the fabric or if it's on the edge of the fabric. And there's almost a full 1/8 inch of play in that. If I were to show you what an 1/8 inch kind of looks like, 1/8 of an inch is really significant. So we can see that here. Once you assemble your units together, the variation between each one of your finished blocks could be up to 1/2 an inch. And when you're trying to square your blocks down that have points on them, you may end up losing some of your points. Another thing that you can exercise when you're putting these 9-patch blocks together is practicing your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Right? Making sure that you're accurately sewing a 1/4 inch. There are lots of different ways that you can test this, by using scrap fabric, sewing them together to make sure that the end product, after you've sewn your strips together, making sure that they are the expected width, right? And if you take a look at your manual for your sewing machine, it will tell you, for the presser feet that go with that machine, it will give you guidance on how to establish a clear 1/4 inch. Where should your fabric be when under a particular foot in order to make sure you have a full 1/4 inch seam? And it also may depend on where your needle is positioned on your machine. I have a regular Brothers sewing machine. It's an embroidery sewing machine combination. In the owner's manual, it tells me a couple of things. So for this type of foot, it doesn't matter if it's metal or if it's acrylic and clear, for this type of foot, it takes the needle in the center position only. And in order for me to get a full and proper 1/4 inch seam, my fabric needs to be right flush with the edge of this presser foot. So as the foot comes down and travels along, my fabric should not be sticking out at all. And it should look something very much like that, where the fabric edge is flush with the edge of the presser foot. So this style here, my user's guide says an accurate 1/4 inch is when the fabric is aligned with the flush edge of this foot. So it should look something where it is flush with this one here, not this thicker part. And there's yet another one that I found interesting, and that is this presser foot. This is the straight stitch presser foot. The 1/4 inch mark, according to the user's manual, is this third divot right here in the toe. that's where your fabric needs to line up. So just make sure that you're double checking what foot you're using and what is the proper site picture and fabric alignment in order to get a proper 1/4 inch seam allowance. So for this simple block today, I'm going to use this 1/4 inch presser foot. I like this one the best so far, but there are times when I prefer to use that acrylic one. Maybe I want to see the fabric. Maybe I want to test my site picture. So let's go ahead and we're going to fold our center unit over our far left unit. And we're going to line that up. And you just got to take your fingers and just kind of encourage the fabric to shift to make sure it's lined up. I'm going to do the same thing with the middle row. Take the center block from the middle row, right sides down, and the same thing again here. And I'm going to chain stitch these 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. All right, so I always start with the top row. All right, first one. Now I'll just grab the second one. And I don't just grab and stick it under and start sewing. I still always make one final check to make sure that it's lined up before I do stick it under the needle. When I'm doing my 9-patch blocks, let's say this is a mini 9-patch block. If I have units inside of my 9-patch that are actually pieced together, I will cut this stitch right here, the threads in between each row, because I want to lay it back out and make sure that I'm lining things up the way that they are intended to be lined up. But if I'm just sewing plain square units together, I can leave these attached. But let's go back. Let me lay this out. It's also good practice, I think, to always return back to your block and lay things out, just to make sure that you haven't sewn a block on the wrong side and reordered or repositioned your units. Now I'm going to go ahead and each row take the third block, right side down, make sure it's lined up, and sew 1/4 inch seam down the right side of each one of these. So let me pick that up, match it up, make sure everything is straight, all the edges are flush. There's the first one. We'll take the second one, following the same process. So here are our rows nicely assembled. There we go. You can press before you assemble your rows, or you can do a finger press. With just simple squares, I'm comfortable with doing a finger press. And the last thing that we can do when we are putting our simple 9-patch blocks together is we can practice nesting our seams. So in a basic 9-patch block, in the middle row, you press your 2 outer block seams towards the middle. And in the top and third row, the first and third row, you want to press the seams away from the center. There may be patterns that will tell you to press your top row all one direction, press your middle row all in the opposing direction, and alternate. So for today though, we're going to follow the basic rule, and we're going to press our top row outward, right? And you can just use your nail. You don't need to stretch or anything. You can use the pad of your finger, right? Hold it down and just slide down. And that'll give you enough of a press and a crease in the fabric to flatten it out, and it'll keep your seam allowance on the other side. The middle row, I'm going to finger press the seam allowance into the middle of the block. So I just use the tips of my finger to gently encourage that fabric to lay all the way open, and there we have it. So nesting seams is something I always try to mention in each video because it's really important, and it's what's going to help you keep your sharp corners, okay? So what I will do is to nest my seams, I'm just going to take my top row, and this is how we're going to assemble it anyways. So you're going to top row, fold it over, right sides facing down, and then once those are together, you'll do the same thing with the bottom row. Flip it over, right side facing down, all right, and each time you'll sew that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if I hold this, right, parallel, we can see what looks like maybe some paddles, right? You can do that. So we have a seam here, that's one seam allowance, and you have the other seam allowance here, right? And what we want to do is we want to make sure this seam right here is nesting up with this seam right here. And we do that by matching it up as close as possible. When I'm looking at nesting my seams, I match it up as close as I can, and then I flatten out those two pieces. And I open it up so I can see whether or not those are lined up. The other thing that we want them to do is we want to make sure that it's touching. So it fits together and lays together like a tongue and groove. If you have your seams nested up nicely, when you put your thumb and forefinger over it to feel it, it feels nice and flat. If your seams are offset, when you pinch it, you'll feel like a divot in there. Opposite though, if you have your seams, if they're crossing over, it feels kind of bulky, right? Because now you have 4 layers of fabric all on top of one another. So I do what I call a pinch and slide test. So if I can pinch it and I don't feel a divot and I don't feel a bump, but I can try to push my fabric, right, by going this way, right? My index finger is going one direction and my thumb is going the other direction. And if it doesn't want to move, then I know it's locked into place. So those are my indicators. Then once I have that seam locked in and I see that my edges are nice and flush, I'll go ahead and pin that in place. So now it's pinned in place and my seams are going to line up. And I'll do the same thing with the other one. Now these 2 rows are ready to assemble. All I've done is I've rotated this around just to give you proper orientation. So once again, I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down the side. When I'm sewing my rows and columns together, I will slow down and I'll drop my needle 1 or 2 stitches into the seam allowance. That's going to hold all of the fabric in place, and then I take the pin out. Some people will leave their pins in. Some people say that's not the right thing to do. It's quilter's choice. And now we're ready to attach the bottom row, following the same steps and guidance as we did with the top and middle row. And that is our 9 patch block put together. So first let's take a look at this block here. So what we're looking for here is we're looking for precise corners. And this is what is the result when you have good nested seams, right? So if we look, these are right on point, as is this side and as is this side. Now, if I look at this one here just a little bit, you might be able to see that there is a very fraction of an inch right there. So that is misaligned, maybe 1/3 of the width of my stiletto, right? It's up to you how perfect you want to be. We all strive to have the best looking quilt, but something like that is definitely, to me, not worth tearing out. The person who's receiving your labor of love as a gift, they're not going to be any wiser. The last thing that I wanted to share with you is how I take a look at my seam allowances to evaluate whether or not I'm staying accurate. If I'm stitching and my stitch line is right here, I will take this ruler right here and I will put that black center line right over the top of it so I basically can't see it. And if I don't see any fabric sticking out of it, I have a nice little happy face. But because I'm going over bumps, right? When I go over the different layers, and I'm stopping to pull out pins and things like that. I will also look to see whether or not when I'm matching these lines up, does my stitch line waver on one side or the other? And if it does, then I try to make sure that I am paying close attention to where I'm going. All right. Who would have thought that so much information can be put into a basic 9-patch quilt block? I hope that you were able to get something out of today's project and take something along with you in your quilting projects moving forward. If you like the content, please go ahead and hit that like button. And if you think others can benefit from this video, please go ahead and share. And I'm always humbled by new subscribers. I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's journey. And until that next journey, please enjoy all of your quilting journeys one stitch at a time.